Yeah, welcome to my presentation. I'm happy to be here. My name is Florian Rupp. I'm a PhD student from the University of Mannheim in Germany. Well, the title is Game Balancing via Procedural Content Generation and Simulations. We know there's a lot of work out there on game balancing and also a lot of work on PCG. But what I do is I combine both things together as one. I focus on how can we generate levels, for example, which are entirely balanced after the generation process. So here it really matters how we spatially distribute entities within the level, for example, to increase the balance for all players. And the last part is simulations. How do we actually estimate if a game is balanced? Well, therefore, I simulate the game. The motivation is also pretty clear. Competitive games must be balanced in order to ensure engagement. This is clear because nobody wants to play an unbalanced game, obviously. Otherwise, the people are bored or they will quit playing it. And PCG helps automating the content generation process, for example, for increasing replayability, decreasing human labor, and so on. But however, there are limitations of existing work. For instance, automated game balancing works tend to use really highly specific solutions. So it's really cumbersome to transfer these solutions to other games. For example, because they use highly game-specific information or data, which is really only useful in this specific game. And so on. For example, when they use simulation-driven methods, they just simulate the game and they actually do not write about how often you actually should simulate in order to have a stable estimation of balance. So my thesis is based on these two gentlemen here, which is I target two different domains, level generation, and we had also a briefly introduction by Sam before on PCGRL, so I hope I don't have to do that, but PCGRL is a framework for level generation using reinforcement learning for tile-based levels. And second, we have game economies, which I also target here in my work. And game economies is introducing, like, for example, a concept how do the transitions how resources in a game are transitioned to other resources, for example, like health points, like dealing damage forever, but also the player's time is really important to balance. So how long should it take to craft the mighty sword in a game? This also has to be balanced. And Clint et al., they introduce a mechanism how to formulate game economies as graph structures where different functional components have different meanings within that economy graph. So I extend the PCGRL framework for balanced level generation, and I do formulate a Markov decision process for balanced level generation. And here, for example, my approach is following. I extend PCGRL, for example, a swap-based representation pattern, for example, in order to here swapping two tiles, for example, the mountain tile and the grass tile, in order to increase the balance for both players here in that example. I have several works published at, for example, COG, also FDG, where I did a lot of experiments for balancing, but also for imbalancing, using also asymmetric player types. And second, I do extend PCGRL for graph data generation. Well, what PCGRL actually does, it manipulates an integer matrix. So, but what not? Use a level for integer representation. It could be also a adjacency matrix of a graph. Yeah, and I showed that using a random noise and using a set of constraints and also a configuration to make it controllable, it works out pretty well to generate graph data using reinforcement learning. However, it is really fast, but the scalability is an issue here. So, and last but not least, I have a GIVU framework, which is for economy generation and balancing. This work uses two evolutionary algorithms in order to generate a graph-based economy graph, and then afterwards it balances it, for example, to address different targets. Like, for example, how many resources of what type do we want to produce in a specific amount of simulation steps? And it is based on the work by Clint et al., which have modeled game economies as graphs before. There's also a cool online tool called Micro-Machinations if you're interested in that. So, and I want to end with these implications. I have three implications of my thesis. The first is when we do automated game balancing, I had the problem that these automations methods, they try to optimize out the probabilistic elements of a game in order to stabilize the balance. However, if you are a game designer, you want to have some probabilistic elements in your game, for example, drawing a card or rolling dice. However, these random elements should have meaning to your game. And in order to stabilize the balance, I have seen that whether on game economies or level balancing, the optimization methods try to neglect these effects. Second, PCGRL is much more than level generation. You can also use it for balance, and I've shown that in many papers. And you can use it also use it for graph data generation as well. And lastly, I argue that games must be balanced, but they must not be fair, because fairness is a socio-economic concept. It considers also the context of players, for example, how skilled are they, what is their cultural background. But in games, we want to make the players the difference. So balance forces an equilibrium. We want that in a perfectly fairly game, thus the outcome will solely depend on luck and not actually on the player's skill. Yeah. Thank you. This would be the end of my talk, and my thesis is already written. The defense will be next month, and then I'm looking for a job. Thank you.